Today we're going to delve into one of the scariest and most distressing mysteries. 7 horror stories involving people who disappeared in the middle of nowhere. Get ready to hear chilling stories of people who disappeared without a trace in remote places, where loneliness, silence, and a lack of answers only make the fear worse. We're going to explore real and suspenseful cases, showing how isolation can turn any trip or adventure into a never-ending nightmare. So, sit back, make sure you know exactly where you are, and let's start this spine-chilling journey. Oh, and before anyone disappears out there, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like. This helps the channel a lot and ensures that you don't miss any scary content like this. Let's go. 1. The disappearance on the Salt Road. The disappearance of Ana and David, which occurred in July 2022 in the Salar de Uyuni, Bolivia, is one of the most disturbing mysteries in the local archives. The Spanish couple set out to cross the Salt Desert in a rented car, planning to document the crossing for an audiovisual project. The beginning of the trip was marked by the fascination of the white vastness, the absolute silence, and the feeling of extreme isolation, broken only by the roar of the engine and the cutting wind. About halfway through the journey, the car developed mechanical problems. After several failed attempts to restart the engine, they realized they were completely alone, with no cell phone signal, little water, and no other vehicles in sight. They decided to leave the car and continue on foot, carrying a backpack with basic supplies and the little water they had left. As they walked, they began to notice strange marks on the ground, tire tracks that appeared and disappeared, human footprints, and scattered personal items. Empty bottles, clothing, a broken watch, a photograph yellow by the sun. Despite these signs that others had passed by, they found no one. The intense heat during the day and the bitter cold at night made the walk exhausting. The silence of the desert was absolute, but they both felt an invisible presence, as if they were being watched from a distance. At night, they set up a makeshift shelter and tried to sleep, but their sleep was interrupted by distant noises, like muffled footsteps on the salt or the rustling of fabrics in the wind. The feeling of vulnerability grew with each hour, amplified by the white immensity that stretched infinitely in all directions. During the second day, the tension increased dramatically. Ana began to report seeing shadows moving on the horizon, always on the periphery of her vision, disappearing when she looked directly at them. David tried to rationalize, attributing the visions to fatigue and dehydration, but he himself felt invisible eyes following his every step. They found more objects along the way: a torn backpack, mismatched shoes, and even a cell phone with a cracked screen, all scattered like breadcrumbs in a dark tail. As they walked, the objects seemed to form a deliberate trail, as if someone had wanted to guide them in a specific direction. Ana suggested that they might be signs from other travelers in need, but the arrangement of the items was too odd to be coincidental. Some were carefully placed on small mounds of salt. Others were partially buried, as if they had been left there on purpose to be found. On the second day, Hannah disappeared. David woke up and couldn't find her. He searched desperately, shouting her name, but all he found were footprints that disappeared into the white and more personal objects that didn't belong to them, as if someone had left clues or wanted to confuse him. Despair took over. The vastness of the desert seemed to swallow his voice, and the echo of his screams was lost in the void. David continued on alone, following tire tracks and footprints, always feeling as though he was being watched. At one point, he came across a makeshift hut made of planks and tarps, where there were scraps of food, an unlit fire, and a notebook with notes of dates, names, and disjointed phrases about eyes on the horizon and don't walk at night. The pages were torn and stained, but they suggested that other people had passed by and also disappeared. David felt a chill and tried to seek shelter, but the uneasiness was unbearable. The silence seemed denser, and any movement in the distance became a cause for alarm. During the night, he heard footsteps around the cabin, but when he went out to investigate, he found only fresh footprints forming perfect circles around the shelter. Fear turned to terror when he realized that the footprints belonged to several different people, all converging on the spot where he was. On the third day, David also disappeared. Days later, rescue teams found the abandoned car, with signs of a hasty search and scattered belongings. There were no clear tracks, only enigmatic marks on the ground and personal items left at random. No trace of the couple was found, despite intensive searches that lasted for weeks. The case was filed as a disappearance under suspicious circumstances. Local residents and guides avoid talking about the matter, but reports from travelers speak of shadows moving across the horizon and footprints appearing and disappearing mysteriously. The Salt Road, which was supposed to be a path to adventure, has become a labyrinth where the silence and vastness hide secrets that no one dares to uncover. This story, based on true events, is a grim warning about the dangers of extreme isolation, where human vulnerability is exploited by presences that prefer to remain invisible and help never arrives in time. 2. The Last Refuge. The disappearance of Marcus Thompson, which occurred in August 2021 in the remote waters of Lake Athabasca in northern Canada, remains one of the most disturbing cases in the U.S. Mounted Police's archives. The story was pieced together from survivors' testimonies, GPS records, and evidence found at the scene. Jake, Marcus, and Riley, friends since college, planned a 5-day kayaking expedition through the Canadian wilderness. The area they chose was known for its untouched beauty and absolute isolation, with hundreds of deserted islands dotted across crystal-clear waters. The trio was well-equipped, with kayaks, camping gear, and supplies to last a week. For the first 2 days, the expedition went smoothly. They paddled through calm waters, camped on secluded beaches, and enjoyed the absolute tranquility. Cell phone reception had disappeared by the second day, but that was to be expected. The wilderness offered exactly what they were looking for, a complete disconnect from the modern world. On the third day, they chose a small rocky island to camp on. The spot seemed perfect, a sheltered beach, fresh water from a spring, and a panoramic view of the lake. As they set up their tents, Jake noticed something strange on the opposite shore, about 200 yards away. A still figure was watching them through the trees. When he pointed at Riley and Marcus, the silhouette quickly disappeared. Riley suggested it was a moose or a bear, but Jake insisted it was human. Marcus, ever skeptical, said it could have been another camper, although it was odd to encounter one in such a remote area. They decided to ignore the incident and continue with their preparations for the night. During dinner, the feeling of being watched intensified. Jake repeatedly pointed out movement on the opposite shore, but the others could see nothing. Tension grew when they found fresh footprints in the sand near where they had pulled up their kayaks. The marks were clearly human, but none of them had walked in that direction. That night, as they chatted around the campfire, they heard the distant sound of oars hitting the water. The noise was coming from the opposite shore, but they could see nothing in the darkness. Riley grabbed a flashlight and swept it across the lake, but the light didn't reach far enough. The sound abruptly stopped, leaving only the eerie silence of the night. In the early morning, Jake woke up with a feeling that something was wrong. He stepped out of the tent and noticed that the fire had been rekindled, although they were sure that it had been completely extinguished. Surrounding the ashes, he found footprints that did not belong to any of them. Fear set in when he realized that the footprints circled all 3 tents, as if someone had been watching them while they slept. He woke his friends and reported the discovery. Marcus, initially skeptical, was visibly disturbed by the sight of the evidence. They decided to take turns keeping watch for the rest of the night, but fatigue and fear made the task nearly impossible. Riley reported seeing lights moving on the opposite shore during his watch, but when he called the others, the lights had disappeared. The next morning, Marcus was gone. His tent was empty, but all his belongings remained intact. There were no signs of a struggle, just footprints leading to the shore and disappearing into the water. Jake and Riley searched desperately, shouting their friend's name, but all they heard was the echo of their own voices. While searching for Marcus, they made a terrifying discovery. In a small clearing in the center of the island, they found evidence that someone had been camping there for days, perhaps weeks. There were remains of old campfires, empty food cans, and most disturbing of all, photographs of the 3 friends that had been secretly taken during the early days of the expedition. The photographs showed them paddling, setting up camp, and sleeping, all taken from a considerable distance with a telescopic lens. In one of the images, they could clearly see the figure of a man hidden among the trees, watching them. The realization that they had been watched from the beginning of the journey filled them with terror. Jake and Riley decided to leave the island immediately. As they prepared their kayaks, they found more disturbing evidence. Ropes tied to trees near the shore, as if someone had used a pulley system to move silently through the water, and a small, camouflage boat hidden among the bushes. During their escape, they felt they were being pursued. The sound of oars accompanied them in the distance, always out of sight but constantly present. They rowed non-stop for hours, until they finally spotted a fishing hut where they were able to radio for help. The search for Marcus lasted weeks, involving helicopters, divers, and rescue teams. He was never found. Investigations revealed that other campers had reported similar experiences in the area in previous months, but none had been taken seriously. The case was filed as a missing person under suspicious circumstances. Jake and Riley never returned to the area, and the area was quietly discouraged for camping by local authorities. To this day, fishermen and guides avoid that part of the lake, especially at night, when they say they can still hear the sound of oars cutting silently through the dark water. 3. The cabin in Forgotten Valley. The disappearance of a group of explorers in Norway's Jotunheimen Valley in September 2023 remains one of the region's most disturbing and mysterious cases. The area, known for its wild beauty and extreme isolation, became the scene of a real-life nightmare that shocked authorities and local residents alike. The following account is reconstructed from found diaries, recovered audio recordings, and testimonies from the sole survivor. 5 friends, all experienced mountain expeditioners, decided to explore a little-known valley in Jotunheimen, far from the usual tourist routes. The aim was to push themselves to the limit and record their journey for a documentary about Norway's wilderness. Equipped with backpacks, climbing gear, cameras, and a week's worth of supplies, they set off confidently, aware of the risks of isolation. The first few days of the hike were peaceful, with stunning views and mild weather. The valley was surrounded by towering mountains, crystal-clear rivers, and dense forests. The cabin they found on the 3rd day seemed like a perfect retreat to rest. Built of weathered wood, with small windows and an unlit chimney, it appeared to be abandoned, but in good condition. As they entered, they noticed personal belongings scattered across the floor and tables. Dirty clothes, worn boots, torn backpacks, and journals with recent entries. The air inside the cabin was cold and damp, and a heavy silence filled the room. The feeling that they were not alone began to grow gradually, like a shadow slowly approaching. During their first night in the cabin, they heard noises coming from the nearby forest. Light footsteps on dry leaves, twigs breaking, and indistinct whispers that seemed to form words. They tried to ignore the sounds, attributing them to the wind and nocturnal animals, but their uneasiness grew with each passing hour. One of the explorers found a camera hidden between the planks of the wall, pointing directly at the cabin door. By the 4th day, they were clearly aware that they were being watched. Flashlights could be seen between the trees at night, and shadows moved silently through the surrounding forest. The group tried to leave the cabin and rejoin the trail, but the path seemed to have changed, as if the forest were alive, manipulating the routes to keep them trapped in the valley. Tensions escalated dramatically when one of the friends mysteriously disappeared during a desperate escape attempt. The others found clear signs of a struggle near the cabin and personal items left behind, indicating that someone was methodically hunting them. The feeling of being monitored and stalked became unbearable, turning every sound in the forest into a potential threat. For the next few nights, the group locked themselves in the cabin, trying to plan a safe exit. Fear and exhaustion took over, and paranoia grew among the remaining members. Footsteps and whispers constantly surrounded the cabin, and the feeling that danger was getting closer was a constant, suffocating presence. In the days leading up to their final disappearance, the group had noticed small, disturbing changes in their surroundings. Fresh footprints around the cabin that appeared at night, branches broken in geometric patterns that looked like signs or messages, and objects that mysteriously disappeared only to reappear in different, unexpected locations. The psychological tension increased exponentially with each passing moment, with constant internal discussions about what to do and who could be behind the systematic persecution. On one of the most terrifying nights, one of the explorers tried to sneak out of the hut to seek help from the nearest village, but never returned. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the previous sounds, and absolute fear gripped those who remained. The hut, which had once seemed like a safe haven from the elements, became a claustrophobic prison. The extreme isolation and growing sense of vulnerability became almost unbearable for the survivors. The only one who managed to escape later reported that at several critical moments, he felt as if the forest itself were conspiring against them, with trails that changed location during the night, sounds that seemed to come simultaneously from all directions, and a darkness that seemed denser and more oppressive than usual. On the last recorded day, the lone survivor managed to escape the hut during a storm, finding help in a nearby village after walking for more than 12 hours. He reported to authorities that the hut was clearly a lookout point for an organized group that monitored and hunted explorers in the region, using the geographic isolation and detailed knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Norwegian police conducted intensive searches that lasted for weeks, but never found those responsible for the disappearances or the bodies of the victims. The case was officially closed as a disappearance under suspicious circumstances, but remains open for further evidence. Residents of nearby villages avoid speaking openly about the valley, and many say the hut remains there, silent and seemingly empty, patiently awaiting its next victim. The story has become a grim warning about the dangers of extreme isolation and human vulnerability to unseen threats that can lurk in the most remote places. This narrative, based on documented real events, reinforces the importance of extreme caution in remote environments and the constant vigilance that can exist where least expected, reminding us that we are not always alone, even in the most isolated places in the world. Hey guys, the stories of people who disappeared in the middle of nowhere are spine-chilling, aren't they? If you're enjoying these suspenseful and tense stories, take a quick break, subscribe to the channel, and leave a like. This really helps the channel grow and motivates me to keep bringing you more spine-chilling content. Now, let's get back to the next stories. There's still a lot of mystery ahead. 4. Sign of life. The disappearance of Lucas Herrera, an Argentine backpacker, which occurred in March 2024 in the remote region of Patagonia, is one of the most intriguing and disturbing cases in the region's recent history. The vastness of the mountains, the biting winds, and the extreme isolation became the setting for a real nightmare, where the line between survival and disappearance became blurred. Lucas, a young adventurer with a passion for hiking and the wilderness, decided to explore one of the least accessible areas of Patagonia, known for its stunning landscapes and hidden dangers, on his own. Equipped with a backpack, basic supplies, and a camera, he planned to document his journey and push himself to the limit. The weather was changeable, with strong winds and low clouds that made it difficult to find his way, but Lucas was confident in his experience. During the third day of hiking, Lucas found an abandoned backpack in a clearing surrounded by trees twisted by the Patagonian wind. When he opened it, he discovered documents, photos, and personal belongings of people who had disappeared in the region in recent years. The shock was immediate. Among the objects was a diary with notes that spoke of a constant presence, someone who knew every shortcut in the mountains and erased the trails of travelers. The pages were stained and some were torn, but the words "He watches us" and "There is no escape" were clearly visible. Determined to seek help, Lucas tried to return along the main trail, but soon realized he was being followed. Silent footsteps echoed behind him, always in sync with his own, as if someone was imitating his movements. Any marks he left on the ground mysteriously disappeared, and branches he broke to mark the path were carefully removed. The feeling of being hunted grew with each passing moment, turning the walk into a desperate escape. Night fell quickly, and the intense cold of Patagonia became a relentless enemy. Lucas set up a makeshift shelter among rocks, but fear would not let him rest. Indistinct sounds came from the forest, and shadows moved among the trees, always out of his field of vision. The wind carried whispers that seemed to form words, and with each gust, Lucas felt the presence approaching. During the early morning hours, he heard whispers and the cracking of branches, as if someone was slowly approaching. He tried to hide behind a rock, but felt a cold touch on his shoulder. He turned quickly, but saw no one. Terror took hold, and he spent the rest of the night awake, watching every shadow, every movement of the vegetation. The next day, Lucas continued his escape, but the feeling of being chased did not cease. He found more belongings scattered along the way, as if the pursuer wanted to send a clear message. There was no escape. At a certain point, he saw a hooded figure watching him from afar, standing motionless among the trees, disappearing as soon as he tried to get closer. The figure seemed to know every stone, every curve of the terrain. Lucas could feel the weight of the silence around him, a silence that seemed to scream. Every step he took was accompanied by a growing fear, as if nature itself were conspiring against him. The vastness of Patagonia, which had previously seemed like an invitation to freedom, now became a prison without walls, where danger was invisible and omnipresent. He tried to remain calm, breathing deeply and focusing on each movement, but physical exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. The water in his bottle was almost gone, and food was scarce. With each passing moment, the feeling of being watched intensified, and he knew he could not let his guard down. The biting cold of the morning gave way to the suffocating heat of midday, and then the cold of the night returned, creating a cycle of physical and mental torment. In a moment of desperation, Lucas tried to leave signs for potential rescuers. He scratched symbols on the ground, left marks on trees, and tried to light small fires, but all his attempts seemed in vain. The strong wind extinguished the flames, and the light rain that began to fall erased his marks. It was as if nature was on the pursuer's side. During an exhausting walk, he noticed that the footprints he left were mysteriously disappearing, as if someone was erasing his tracks. Paranoia took over, and he began to doubt his own sanity. Every shadow, every sound seemed to hide a threat. The echo of his own footsteps mixed with other sounds, creating a symphony of terror. On a particularly cold night, Lucas heard distant voices, whispers that seemed to be calling his name. He tried to respond, but the echo of his voice seemed to be lost in the void. The darkness of the night was deep, and the loneliness was overwhelming. Fear turned to despair when he realized that the voices were coming from different directions, as if multiple people were surrounding him. At dawn, he found a trail that seemed to lead him out of the forest, but his hope was short-lived. The trail disappeared into a swampy terrain, and he had to turn back, exhausted and disoriented. With each attempt to escape, it seemed that his pursuer anticipated his movements, blocking routes and forcing him to walk in circles. With each passing day, Lucas felt time slipping away, the minutes dragging on like hours. Hunger, cold, and fear mixed together in a storm that threatened to consume his will to live. His strength was running out, but the presence that followed him seemed tireless, always one step behind, always watching. Physical and mental exhaustion was mounting, and Lucas knew he had to find help before it was too late. In a last desperate attempt, he reached a small abandoned cabin, where he found an old radio. He tried to use it, but all he could hear was static and distorted voices that seemed to whisper threats. The old radio, with its distorted voices, seemed like a whisper from beyond, a warning that he was not alone and that danger was closer than he had ever imagined. Days later, rescue teams found the cabin, but Lucas had disappeared again. Only his backpack and the belongings of previous victims were found, along with strange marks on the ground, as if someone had carefully covered all traces. Authorities also found footprints that formed circles around the cabin, suggesting that Lucas had been surrounded before he disappeared. The case was filed as a missing person under suspicious circumstances, but locals and travelers avoid the area, fearing that the presence that haunts travelers is still lurking, covering its tracks and waiting for its next victim. Experienced guides in the area report that, to this day, they find personal items scattered around the area, always arranged in a way that looks like messages or warnings. Lucas Herrera's story is a grim reminder that even in the most remote and beautiful places on the planet, danger can lurk, unseen and relentless, ready to snuff out any sign of life. This story, based on true events, is a grim warning about the dangers of extreme isolation and human vulnerability to unseen threats that can lurk in the world's most remote mountains. 5. The Ghost Train of the Desert. The case of the tourist train that derailed in the middle of the Bitpakdala Desert in Kazakhstan in August 2023 is one of the darkest and most mysterious episodes in the region's recent history. What began as a leisurely trip turned into a nightmare of isolation, fear, and unexplained disappearances, leaving authorities and families searching for answers that never came. The train, known as the Dawn of the Desert, was a popular attraction for tourists who wanted to explore the vast and inhospitable landscapes of the Bitpakdala Desert, a remote and sparsely populated region marked by sand dunes, arid plains, and an absolute silence that seemed to swallow all sound. On that fateful journey, about 50 passengers boarded the train in Almaty, eager for a 3-day journey to the city of Aktobe, through the heart of the desert. The train was modern, equipped with comfortable cabins, a restaurant, and even an observation car to enjoy the scenery. On the second day, during the early hours of the morning, the train derailed in an isolated area, far from any road or sign of civilization. The impact was violent, but surprisingly, most of the passengers survived, although many were injured and disoriented. When they tried to use their cell phones to call for help, they realized that all means of communication had been sabotaged. Cell phone, radio, and satellite signals were blocked. The train's electrical system was also faulty, leaving them without light or heat in the bitter cold of the desert at night. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming. The desert seemed like a vast void that swallowed the train and its occupants, leaving them at the mercy of the unknown. Soon, they began to realize that they were not alone. Personal belongings were mysteriously disappearing, and some passengers reported seeing shadows moving among the nearby dunes. Fear turned to panic when, in the morning, one of the passengers disappeared without a trace. The search was immediate, but they found no sign, only footprints that ended abruptly in the sand. As the hours passed, more passengers began to disappear, one by one, always silently and without any clues. The remaining group realized that someone or something was eliminating them, but there was no way to identify who was responsible. The tension increased with each moment, and the distrust among the survivors grew. They tried to organize shifts to keep watch, but fear and fatigue made the task almost impossible. The nights were marked by strange sounds, footsteps in the sand, distant whispers, and the rustling of the wind that seemed to carry voices. One night, a group decided to explore the nearby dunes, hoping to find help or some sign of civilization. What they found was a series of makeshift traps made of ropes and stakes, clearly set up to capture or injure. Desperation took over. The group returned to the train, but the feeling that they were being watched did not leave them. With each step, they felt that someone knew their every move, every possible escape route. During the day, they tried to use the train's equipment to send emergency signals, but discovered that the systems had been meticulously sabotaged, as if whoever was in charge knew exactly what they were doing. Paranoia set in. Some passengers became suspicious of each other, while others believed that an outside group, perhaps local criminals, was hunting them. The cold of the night was relentless, and food was running out. Hope of rescue dwindled with each passing hour. In the midst of this terrifying scene, small details began to emerge, further increasing the climate of distrust and fear. One of the passengers found a knife hidden under his seat, without knowing how it had gotten there. Another noticed that his clothes had been discreetly cut during the night, as if someone had approached without being noticed. In addition, anonymous messages began to appear, written in sand on the train platform or scratched on the walls of the cabins. "You will not get out of here. The desert is ours. Every step is watched." These messages increased the panic and the feeling that they were trapped in a carefully planned trap. During an escape attempt, a small group tried to hike toward a nearby hill, where they believed they would have a better view of the terrain and perhaps a cell phone signal. However, upon reaching it, they found an area surrounded by stakes and nets, a trap that nearly captured them. They narrowly escaped, but the fear that the enemy knew every inch of the desert became even more real. The nights were the worst. The biting cold, the absolute darkness, and the unexplained sounds created an atmosphere of constant terror. Some passengers reported seeing hooded figures moving among the dunes, silently watching them. Others heard voices whispering their names, coming from the emptiness of the desert. The psychological tension reached its peak when one of the survivors, in a moment of desperation, tried to confront whoever he believed to be responsible, but mysteriously disappeared during the night, leaving behind only a muffled scream and a trail of blood in the sand. Distrust among the survivors grew to unbearable levels. Heated arguments and accusations began to arise, fragmenting the group. Some believed that the enemy had infiltrated their midst, while others feared that the threat was external, an unseen predator manipulating the environment to its advantage. Amidst this chaos, an older passenger, who kept a detailed diary, tried to organize the group, proposing survival and surveillance strategies. He encouraged unity, but the tension and fear made every decision a challenge. The cold of the night seemed to penetrate to the bones, and hunger and thirst began to affect the survivors' lucidity. Some began to hallucinate, seeing figures that were not there, hearing voices that did not exist. The desert, with its vastness and silence, seemed to play with their minds. In the last log found, the passenger wrote, "We are surrounded. We do not know who the enemy is, but he is among us or very close. Each shadow may be the last." Days later, rescue teams arrived at the scene but found the train empty, with signs of struggle and belongings scattered around. None of the passengers were found, and the search ended with no answers. 6. The Shadow Camp. The mysterious disappearance of teenagers at a summer camp in the Appalachians in the summer of 2023 has become one of the most disturbing and enigmatic cases in the region. What was supposed to be a recreational experience and contact with nature turned into a nightmare of fear, isolation, and psychological terror. The following account was reconstructed from testimonies of the survivors, records found at the site, and police investigations. Camp Pine Hollow, located in a remote area of the Appalachians, was known for its natural beauty and the tranquility it offered to young people during the summer. Young people from all over the United States would come here to participate in outdoor activities, learn about nature, and make new friends. The camp was surrounded by dense forest, with winding trails and secluded areas, perfect for adventure and exploration. In the summer of 2023, a group of 15 teenagers arrived at camp for a 2-week stint. Among them were Emma, Jake, Sarah, Tyler, and Mia, lively, energetic young people eager to make the most of every moment. The experienced and trained counselors ensure the safety and well-being of the participants, but no one could have predicted what was to come. During the first few days, everything went smoothly. Activities included hiking, climbing, campfires, and nighttime games. The group got along well, and the feeling of freedom and relaxation was palpable. The nights were marked by laughter, stories told around the campfire, and the brightness of the stars that seemed to protect the camp. But on the third night, Mia disappeared. Initially, they thought she had wandered off to explore the forest, but their searches were fruitless. Fear began to set in, and the atmosphere at the camp changed dramatically. The counselors tightened the rules, banning nighttime outings and increasing patrols. But Mia's disappearance was only the beginning. The following night, Tyler also disappeared. Panic gripped the group. The search was intensified with the help of local teams, but no trace of the missing teenagers was found. The feeling that they were being watched grew with each passing moment. While searching the forest, Sarah and Emma found a small camera hidden among the trees, pointing directly at the camp. The discovery shocked everyone. The camera was connected to a recording system that appeared to have been installed years ago, monitoring the young people's every move. From then on, paranoia set in. The remaining teenagers began to realize that they were not only lost or in natural danger, but that someone was watching them, hidden in the forest with unknown and frightening intentions. Small personal items disappeared, and signs of someone moving silently among the trees increased their terror. Emma, Sarah, and Jake decided to investigate on their own. One night, they followed little-used trails and found a hidden cabin, camouflaged among the vegetation. Inside, they found surveillance equipment, maps of the camp, and notes indicating that the young people had been closely monitored, including their schedules, routes, and behaviors. Fear turned to despair when they realized that the observer was not a passing stranger, but someone who knew the area and the camp intimately, able to move around undetected. The feeling of being hunted became real. Over the next few days, the group tried to remain calm, but the tension grew with each passing moment. The nights were the worst. The sounds of footsteps, whispers, and the creaking of broken branches kept everyone on constant alert. Emma reported seeing shadows moving between the trees, always out of her field of vision, while Sarah felt something touching her backpack when she wasn't looking. The counselors tried to organize the group, but fear and exhaustion made every decision difficult. Arguments escalated and distrust grew. Some believed the observer might be one of the counselors themselves, while others feared it was a stranger who had been hiding in the forest for years, watching and waiting for the right moment to act. On a particularly tense night, Emma and Sarah decided to set up a makeshift trap, using flashlights and ropes to try to capture the intruder. They spent hours hiding, listening to every sound, every movement. When they finally heard footsteps approaching, they held their breath. But the figure that appeared was quick and silent, disappearing before they could react. Last night, Emma and Sarah were caught in a trap and captured. Jake managed to escape and alert the authorities. The police conducted an intensive search, but the missing people were never found. The case was closed as a disappearance under suspicious circumstances. Pine Hollow Campground has been closed, and the surrounding forest remains off-limits to residents and visitors alike. Reports of shadows in the trees, unexplained sounds, and the constant feeling of being watched continue to haunt the area. 7. The abandoned lighthouse. The disappearance of 2 photographers on the island of Skellig Michael, off the coast of Ireland, in October 2023 remains one of the most disturbing and mysterious cases in the region. The island, famous for its ancient lighthouse and atmosphere of absolute isolation, became the scene of a nightmare that left its mark on authorities and local residents. The story below was reconstructed from diaries, audio recordings, and the testimony of the sole survivor. 2 friends, Thomas and Liam, both professional photographers, decided to explore the deserted island to capture unique images of the centuries-old lighthouse and the wild landscape. The island, accessible only by boat in favorable weather conditions, was known for both its beauty and its mystery. Reports of previous disappearances of visitors had never been explained. Upon landing, they were greeted by a cold, biting wind that seemed to carry ancient secrets. They set up camp near the lighthouse, installed their equipment, and prepared for days of intense work. The isolation was total. With no cell phone signal, the only contact with the mainland was a short-wave radio, which worked only sporadically. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. Thomas and Liam explored the island, photographing the cliffs, the lighthouse, and the local wildlife. At night, they shared stories around the campfire, tried to ward off the cold and loneliness. But they soon began to realize that they were not alone. During an evening walk, Liam noticed a distant figure watching them from atop a hill. When he tried to get closer, the figure disappeared among the rocks. Skeptical Thomas attributed the sight to fatigue, but the feeling of being watched persisted. On the second night, when reviewing the day's photos, they noticed strange images, shadows that didn't correspond to anything they knew, eyes glowing between the trees, and marks on the ground that looked like traps. Fear set in. During the early hours of the morning, Liam mysteriously disappeared. Thomas woke up to absolute silence and the absence of his friend. He searched frantically, shouting his name, but found only footprints leading into the forest and disappearing abruptly. Over the next few days, Thomas found records of previous visitors, diaries, cameras, and abandoned equipment, all indicating that Liam was not the first to disappear. One of the journals reported silent pursuits, hidden traps, and a presence that watched and waited for the right moment to act. Thomas discovered makeshift traps around the island, camouflage snares, holes covered with leaves and rocks, signs made of branches indicating false routes. The island seemed like a deadly maze, where each step could be his last. Isolation, fear, and exhaustion began to take their toll on him. He knew he had to get out of there, but the feeling of being hunted was constant. During an escape attempt, he almost fell into a trap, barely saving himself. The nights were marked by strange sounds, footsteps, whispers, and the creaking of trees in the wind. On a narrow trail, Thomas felt something following him. He stopped and hid behind a rock, holding his camera like a weapon. He heard slow, heavy footsteps approaching, but he could see nothing but darkness. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Another night, he found symbols scratched into the rocks, which looked like messages or warnings. He tried to photograph them, but the camera mysteriously failed, turning itself off. The feeling that the island was alive, watching and manipulating every move, became unbearable. Thomas began to avoid open areas and only moved around during the day. But even then he felt the presence surrounding him. In a moment of desperation, he tried to use the radio to call for help, but all he could hear was static and distorted voices, as if someone was jamming the signal. Hunger and fatigue began to affect his judgment. He got lost several times, finding trails that led to dead ends or natural traps. On one occasion, he nearly fell into a hidden hole, saved by a branch he held tightly. One particularly cold morning, Thomas heard voices whispering his name from different directions. He tried to respond, but the echo of his voice seemed to be lost in the void. The darkness of the night was deep, and the loneliness was overwhelming. Fear turned to despair. Over the next few days, he found more evidence that he was not alone. Torn clothes, broken equipment, and marks of struggle. At one point, he found a hidden camera pointing at his camp, its battery nearly dead. Physical and mental exhaustion was mounting, and Thomas knew he had to find help before it was too late. In a last desperate attempt, he reached the shore and flagged down a passing boat. Rescued, he reported everything to the authorities, who organized a search of the island, but never found a trace of Liam or those responsible for the disappearances. The case was closed as a missing person under suspicious circumstances, but Skellig Michael Island remains avoided by locals and tourists alike. Reports of shadows, booby traps, and the constant feeling of being watched continue to haunt those who venture there. And so we come to the end of our 7 horror stories involving missing people in the middle of nowhere. So, which one scared you the most? Will any of them make you think twice before venturing into isolated places? Tell us in the comments which one was your favorite. If you enjoyed this dive into the darker side of mysterious disappearances, don't forget to leave a like. This really helps the channel grow and encourages me to bring you more spine-chilling stories. And if you're not a subscriber yet, take advantage of it now to subscribe and activate the bell.